The first thing I remember was the sheer scale of it. Not a scattering of flares drifting aimlessly, not aircraft on maneuvers, not anything that could be dismissed as routine. It was vast, deliberate, and silent, an entire sky devoured by something I could not explain. I was near the tarmac of Luke Air Force Base when it appeared. The desert night was cool, the stars crisp against the black canvas, the kind of clarity you only get in Arizona. I had just stepped out to stretch my legs, expecting the uneventful rhythm of another watch. Then I saw the formation. At first, I thought it was multiple craft, a series of brilliant golden white orbs, arranged in a perfect V, gliding in absolute silence across the horizon. But the longer I looked, the more I realized these lights were not separate. They moved as one, fixed in relation to each other, as though mounted on a single, incomprehensibly massive structure too dark to reflect starlight. As it passed overhead, it blotted out the heavens. Stars disappeared behind it, leaving only emptiness. I had trained in F-16s, memorized the silhouettes of every known aircraft, studied the behavior of flares and countermeasures, logged thousands of hours under the command of some of the most skilled pilots in the world. Nothing I had seen prepared me for this. My instincts told me to act, call it in, scramble jets, follow procedure. Yet something deeper inside me froze. Awe, terror, disbelief, they all tangled into paralysis. It was as though the earth itself had stopped breathing to watch what hovered above us. That was March 13th, 1997. The night civilians came to call the Phoenix Lights. For me, it became the night the skies I swore to defend no longer felt like ours. The phones rang first at the base. Local police stations, then air traffic controllers, then eventually our own lines. Reports flooded in of lights. Some described them as hovering. Others swore it was a massive craft. All said the same thing. Silent, deliberate, undeniable. We checked radar. Nothing. No signatures. No evidence of anything unusual. And yet, outside, the truth was written across the sky. Radar, for all its sophistication, was blind to what our eyes could not deny. When I stepped back inside, I found men staring at each other in silence. Radios hissed with static. A few muttered theories. Experimental craft, atmospheric reflection, misidentified aircraft. But their voices betrayed the same unease etched on their faces. These were seasoned airmen, men who had flown combat missions, men who had seen the sky at its most dangerous. Yet in that moment, they looked like boys staring at something they could not fight. I stepped back out again, needing to see it for myself. And it was still there. The light stretched across the horizon, moving slowly, deliberately, like giants on parade. They passed over Phoenix, and I knew thousands, tens of thousands, were seeing the same thing I was. From a Nevada line to the edge of Mexico, civilians looked up that night and felt the same awe, the same terror. Later, officials would say flares. They would insist nothing unusual had occurred. But flares fall. They flicker, they sputter, they drift apart. These lights held formation with military precision, gliding as one. They dimmed only when they wanted to, vanishing not like fire, but like thought. Inside the base, the atmosphere shifted from disbelief to something darker. Orders came fast, sharp. Pilots were told to remain grounded. Some whispered that jets had been scrambled, only to return with nothing to report. I saw their eyes, though. I saw the silence that told me they had seen what I had seen, even if their lips would never form the words. What unsettled me most was a feeling, an intuition deeper than training, deeper than logic, that the formation wanted to be seen. This was not a stealth incursion, not a covert maneuver. It was a display, a presence announcing itself. The silence of the craft was not emptiness. It was intent. By morning, the official narrative was already forming. Reports were collected. Witnesses were quietly interviewed. And then came the press conference. The governor of Arizona, standing before cameras, smirking as he dragged out a staffer in an alien costume to laughter from a room. The crowd laughed. The headlines chuckled and the public exhaled. But those of us who had stood under that endless V knew the truth. The joke was not for reassurance. It was for control. That night, the desert had shifted. The world had shifted. I had looked up at the sky and seen something so vast, so deliberate, that it unraveled the illusion of command we clung to. We trained, we drilled, we believed in control of the skies. But the sky was never ours. Even now, decades later, I ask myself what you would have done in my place. If you stood under that black canopy, stars erased by a shape larger than any city block, light steady and silent in perfect symmetry, would you run? Would you call for help? Would you believe your own eyes? I didn't run. I didn't call. I stood frozen, watching as the world shifted above me. And even then, I knew. What we saw over Phoenix that night was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of one far larger than any of us could comprehend. The morning after the lights passed over Phoenix, the desert sun rose on a city divided between awe and ridicule. For every witness who swore they had seen something extraordinary, there were officials ready with explanations that reduced a night to a mistake, a trick of perception, or an illusion crafted by flares. But those of us in uniform knew it was neither mistake nor trick. It had been deliberate. At Luke Air Force Base, the official line came swiftly. Deny, deflect, dismiss. Orders filtered down through channels with military efficiency. If asked, we were to describe the lights as standard training activity. No deviations, no embellishments, no speculation. Yet the silence in the barracks told a different story. Men who had flown countless missions, who had faced enemy fire, avoided each other's eyes. They didn't laugh. They didn't joke. They carried the same haunted look that had settled into me. I was summoned to a debriefing that morning. A small, windowless room, the kind where fluorescent lights hum just loud enough to remind you of the walls pressing in. Two men in suits, not uniforms, asked the questions. They weren't interested in feelings or impressions. They wanted details. How many lights did I see? What formation did they hold? How long were they visible? Could I confirm if they were separate or a single structure? Their questions were precise, methodical, as though they were checking my answers against a script already written. When I asked what the lights were, they offered no answers, only warnings. They reminded me of duty, of secrecy, of the risks of speculation. They told me the incident was under review, and that would be handled at higher levels. The message was clear. My role was to obey, not understand. Later, when the governor's press conference aired, we gathered in the mess hall to watch. He smiled for the cameras, joked with reporters, and paraded a staffer in a cheap alien costume. The room filled with uneasy laughter. Some shook their heads. Others cursed under their breath. But what struck me most was the silence that followed. Not one of us believed him. Not one of us thought it was funny. We all knew it was theater. Theater designed not for us, but for the public. Outside the base, the story was spreading faster than it could be contained. Civilians across Arizona spoke to local news stations. Truck drivers described the craft gliding silently over highways. Families reported watching the formation from their backyards. Entire neighborhoods had stood together that night, pointing upward, united by disbelief. Thousands of witnesses, all telling the same story. And yet, the official narrative hardened. Flares. The Air Force insisted that what people had seen was a training exercise. Illumination flares released south of Phoenix during operations at the Berry Goldwater Range. On paper, it made sense. Flares explained lights in the sky. Flares explained civilian panic. But flares cannot explain what I saw. They cannot explain a V-shaped formation spanning the width of a city. They cannot explain lights that glided with precision, holding their position across miles of sky. Flares fall. These did not. I began to notice something unsettling. Witnesses who spoke too loudly, too publicly, found themselves discredited. Some were mocked in newspapers. Others were labeled unreliable. A few who had been confident in their testimonies suddenly grew quiet, withdrawing from the spotlight. It was as if an invisible hand was pressing down, erasing credibility one voice at a time. Inside the base, files disappeared as quickly as they appeared. Logs were redacted. Reports that had been drafted the night of the incident were revised with clinical language that stripped away any hint of the extraordinary. What had been anomalous formation of lights became probable aerial flares. What had been unexplained visual observation became training activity misperceived by civilians. It was a transformation not of facts, but of narrative, and it was not the first time I had seen it happen. I remembered Roswell, years earlier, reduced from a crash to a weather balloon. I remembered the Rendlesham incident in England, where servicemen described a craft with symbols, only for it to be dismissed as a lighthouse. The pattern was familiar, an extraordinary event, followed by ridicule, followed by silence. Always the same, always controlled. That realization planted a question I could never shake. Were these incidents isolated, or were they chapters in a single long story? For weeks after the Phoenix Lights, the base remained tense. Pilots whispered about what they had seen in the air that night. Some swore they had been scrambled and told to chase the lights, only to find nothing their instruments could detect. Others claimed they had been ordered to stand down entirely. No one knew what was true, and perhaps that was the point. Confusion is its own kind of control. The civilians, however, could not be silenced so easily. Night after night, local news stations interviewed ordinary people who insisted they had seen a craft larger than a football field, gliding silently across the desert sky. Teachers, police officers, doctors, retirees, people with nothing to gain and everything to lose, spoke with conviction. Their voices shook, not with fear, but with the certainty of those who know what they saw. And then the calls began to reach beyond Arizona. National outlets picked up the story. Talk shows debated it. Researchers compared the Phoenix Lights to sightings in other countries. Suddenly, Phoenix was not just a local mystery. It was a piece of something global. That was when I understood the truth. What we had seen that night was not an accident. It was not a mistake. It was a message. But a message to whom and why? What struck me most in the weeks that followed was not the silence of the military, but the noise of the people. The phones at news stations rang without pause. Letters poured into editors' desks. Radio shows filled with callers insisting they'd seen the same thing I had. A vast, silent V gliding overhead, blotting out the stars. Thousands of voices, each telling the same story in different words, until disbelief itself began to sound foolish. And yet, disbelief was exactly what officials demanded. The Air Force doubled down on its flare explanation. Press releases were crafted with careful language. Training exercises, illumination devices, misidentified activity. On paper was simple, but in the streets of Phoenix, it was impossible to reconcile. How could thousands mistake flares for a structured craft? How could entire families, spread across the state, all describe the same triangular formation? I remember watching local television one night. A clip of a mother and her children standing outside their home, pointing to the sky as they described what they had seen. Their words were calm, steady, as though they were describing a neighbor's car parked at the curb. Not hysterical, not fanciful, just honest. And I thought to myself, how many of us have to speak before someone listens? But the more people spoke, the more they were ridiculed. Newspapers ran cartoons of flying saucers. Late-night talk shows joke about alien traffic jams over Arizona. Even the governor's mocking press conference continued to circulate, replayed again and again as proof that nothing serious had happened. The public was divided. Some believed. Many laughed. And the laughter was powerful. Nothing buries truth faster than a joke. Still, beneath the ridicule, the incident refused to die. UFO researchers arrived in Arizona, interviewing witnesses, cataloging testimonies, analyzing video footage captured by shaky home cameras. The images were grainy and imperfect, but unmistakable, a line of lights, steady and symmetrical, moving as one. The more the footage spread, the harder it became to ignore. I began to sense something deeper at work, not just in Phoenix, but everywhere, because as researchers compared notes, they found similarities. Sightings in Mexico of triangular formations, reports from Belgium in the early 90s of massive, silent black triangles floating low over towns, accounts from pilots in South America describing lights that paced their jets in silence. Always triangles, always silent, always denied. It was not just Phoenix. It was a pattern. Inside the base, whispers spread among the men. Some had family in other states who told similar stories. Others remembered their fathers' tales of strange lights during the Vietnam War. A few mentioned Rendlesham, That December night in Suffolk years earlier, when U.S. airmen stood in a forest staring at a craft etched with symbols. The details varied, but the feeling was the same. Encounters with something vast, something unclaimed, something both undeniable and untouchable. For me, the memory of March 13th grew sharper, not weaker. I would replay it in my mind, the way the lights held perfect formation, the way the stars vanished as the craft passed. Each time, I searched for doubt, for some crack in the memory that would let me believe the official story. But the crack never came. The memory remained whole, unshakable. What I found instead was obsession. At night, I drove into the desert, parking miles from the city, staring up at the sky as though willing it to happen again. Sometimes I imagined I saw faint lights, distant and drifting. Sometimes it was only stars. But always, I felt that same presence, as though the silence of that night had never left. I began collecting clippings, much like Carlson had after Rendlesham, folders filled with reports, testimonies, interviews. My desk became cluttered with notes, diagrams, rough sketches of the V-shape. It was not duty anymore. It was hunger, and I knew I was not alone. Across Phoenix, across Arizona, across the world, witnesses carried the same weight. Some hid it, some spoke. A few shouted until their voices cracked. But all of us knew something had happened, something beyond denial. What unsettled me most was the possibility that the event had been intentional, that the craft, or whatever intelligence controlled it, wanted to be seen. Unlike Rendlesham, hidden in the woods of Suffolk, Phoenix was spectacle, tens of thousands of eyes, a city-wide stage. It was not stealth, it was display. And if it was display, then the question becomes, display for whom? For us, the civilians and soldiers of Arizona? For the government, watching quietly as reports flooded in? Or for the world, a message written not in words but in silence across the night sky? Years later, when footage of naval pilots chasing tic-tac objects was released, I felt the same chill. Different shapes, different settings, but the same impossible movement, the same silence, the same denial, always denial. Phoenix was not an ending. It was a chapter, one among many. And yet, it is the chapter one lived. The night that carved itself into me. The night I learned that the skies we guard are not ours. The hardest part was not that the craft appeared. The hardest part was what came after. You would think the sight of something so vast, so undeniable, would change everything, that the world would stop and ask questions that could not be ignored. But what followed was not revelation. It was ridicule. It was control. It was silence. Inside Luke Air Force Base, the mood curdled into something heavy. The mess hall, once filled with banter and noise, became hushed. Men ate in silence, pushing food around their trays, eyes distant. We didn't need to talk about what we'd seen. It lived in the lines of our faces. The younger airmen avoided the subject altogether, terrified that a slip of the tongue might ruin their careers. The older ones grew quiet, staring into nothing as though replaying the night again and again in their minds. Sleep became my enemy. Each time I closed my eyes, I was back under that endless V. The lights hovered above me, steady and unblinking, and the silence pressed against my skin like a weight. Sometimes, in dreams, the lights broke formation and descended, surrounding me until the night dissolved into white. I would wake soaked in sweat, heart pounding, certain for a moment that I had never left the tarmac at all. I tried to tell myself it was imagination, that the mind, faced with the incomprehensible, invents shapes and stories to fill the gaps. But the memory never faded. It remained sharp, steady, undeniable. I could recall the exact spacing of the lights, the angle of the formation, the way stars vanished behind it. No dream carries such precision. This was no invention. This was a scar. Some of us coped in silence. Others turned to drink. A few buried themselves in work, volunteering for any task that would keep their minds occupied. But no matter how we tried to bury it, the weight remained. What made it worse was the official response. When the governor mocked the incident on live television, we felt betrayed. Not because we expected the government to tell the full truth, but because the mockery told us our silence was permanent. The laughter was a lock, and we were inside it. Years later, when that same governor admitted he had seen the lights himself and had only mocked them to calm public hysteria, the damage was already done. The ridicule had worked. The truth had been buried under jokes. I began to lose faith in the system I had sworn to serve. If they could twist something so vast, so undeniable, into farce, what else had been twisted? What other truths had been wrapped in laughter, stored in silence, and filed away where no one could touch them? That was when I started to study. I dug into Roswell, Rendlesham, the Belgian wave, the countless sightings dismissed as weather balloons, swamp gas, flares. Always the same pattern. Witnesses mocked, data erased, explanations neat enough to fit into a headline, but hollow enough to dissolve under scrutiny. The realization was corrosive. It ate at my loyalty. I had spent my life believing in command, in chain of authority, in the idea that the men above me knew what I did not and carried burdens I could not. But Phoenix shattered that faith. The men above me didn't know. Or worse, they knew and chose to bury it. I kept notebooks, sketches of the lights, clippings from newspapers, transcriptions of interviews with witnesses. My desk grew cluttered, a mirror of the chaos in my mind. Some nights I stared at the drawings until they blurred, until I could almost convince myself I had invented it all. But then the image would return, sharp and undeniable. Memory does not lie, not when it burns itself into you like fire. And still, I asked myself, why us? Why Phoenix? Why that night? If the craft, or whatever intelligence controlled it, wanted to remain hidden, it could have. It moved in silence, undetectable by radar, gliding with precision beyond our technology. And yet it revealed itself, not to a handful of soldiers in a remote forest, but to tens of thousands across a state. It was not stealth. It was spectacle. That truth unsettled me more than anything, because spectacle implies intention. Someone or something wanted to be seen. But by whom? By the public, left to argue and mock? By the government, forced into silence and control? By the military, left haunted and powerless? Or perhaps by all of us? That is the question I cannot silence. Decades have passed since that night, yet Phoenix has never truly left me. I have lived through wars, elections, crises, and personal storms, but always, in quiet moments, my thoughts circle back to March 13th, 1997, the night the sky fell silent, the night the stars were devoured by something vast and deliberate, the night I realized that what we guard is not ours to control. The world moved on, at least on the surface. News cycles shifted. New scandals emerged. The laughter from that governor's press conference echoed louder than the silence of the craft. For many, Phoenix became a footnote, a curiosity trotted out on anniversaries, a favor for late-night talk shows and conspiracy programs. The ridicule stuck, because ridicule is easier to carry than fear. But for those of us who were there, the night never ended. We became carriers of memory too heavy to share and too sharp to forget. Veterans of a war with no battlefield, no enemy, and no victory. Witnesses not to combat, but to revelation. Over the years, I met others who had stood beneath different skies and felt the same weight. A Belgian police officer who watched a silent triangle drift over his town in 1990. A naval pilot who tracked a tic-tac object darting across the Pacific, faster than any jet could dream. A farmer in Mexico who saw lights hover above his fields in silence, then vanish as if erased. None of them knew each other. None of them shared culture or language, and yet all told the same story. Vast silent craft, impossible movement, denial and ridicule in the aftermath. Patterns, always patterns. And that, perhaps, is the real secret. The craft themselves are extraordinary, yes, but what truly matters is the repetition. The message is not in a single event, but in the accumulation. Roswell, Rendlesham, Belgium, Phoenix, the Pacific encounters. Each one alone can be dismissed. Together, they form a chorus that cannot be ignored forever. Sometimes, I wonder if that is the point, if these appearances are not accidents, but invitations, not invasions, but rehearsals. Displays staged not to terrify, but to prepare. For what? I cannot say. But no one watches silently forever. The ridicule continues, of course. It is powerful, maybe the most powerful weapon of all. Laughter disarms truth faster than denial. But cracks are forming. Documents declassified. Videos released. Pilots speaking openly. Even governments admitting, carefully, that there are things in the sky we cannot explain. The laughter is quieter now. The questions are louder. Still, one truth remains. That night in Phoenix was not about flares, not about mistakes, not about hysteria. It was about presence. An undeniable presence that revealed itself not to generals in secret rooms, but to ordinary people looking up from their driveways and porches. A presence that moved in silence across the desert sky, as if writing across the heavens. We are here. And here is a question I leave you with. If you had seen it, if you had stood beneath that endless V, felt the silence press against your skin, watched the stars vanish above you, would you have believed the ridicule? Would you have accepted the word flares? Would you have laughed with the governor and gone back to sleep? Or would you, like me, carry the memory forever, knowing that for one night the truth revealed itself, undeniable and uninvited? I cannot laugh. I cannot forget. I cannot look at the sky the same way. Because on March 13th, 1997, Phoenix was not just a city in the desert. It was a witness to something vast, something deliberate, something that told us the skies are not ours. And though decades have passed, I still believe the silence that hovered over us that night has not gone away. It waits, patient and watchful, for another display, another night, another city, perhaps yours. Until then, I remain what I was that night, a soldier who looked up and saw the impossible. Inside Luke Air Force Base, the hours following the sighting were unlike anything I had ever experienced before. I had stood through simulated attacks, watched radar anomalies trigger false alarms, even endured tense nights when we thought Soviet bombers might be testing our defenses. But nothing prepared me for the chaos of silence that followed March 13th, 1997. By the time I returned indoors after seeing the V-shaped formation glide across the desert sky, the command center was already unraveling. Phones were ringing nonstop. Operators shouted over each other as they logged reports from across the state. What began as a handful of calls escalated into hundreds, then thousands. Police dispatchers were overwhelmed, struggling to track the flood of witness statements. News stations were airing live phone-ins from terrified civilians. Airline pilots flying commercial routes reported seeing the lights glide silently beneath them. It felt as though the entire state of Arizona had stopped what it was doing to look upward, united by disbelief. And yet, on our radar screens, nothing. No blip, no transponder codes, no unidentified tracks. Just empty skies, mocking the chaos that surrounded us. For every frantic voice reporting strange lights, the radar returned silence, as though the heavens themselves had been scrubbed clean. That contradiction cut deeper than any fear. The undeniable clashing with the invisible. To acknowledge what was happening meant admitting our technology, our entire defensive shield, was blind. For military installation, that was unthinkable. Orders came quickly. They always did in moments like this. But these orders carried a different weight. We were to observe, record, but above all, remain silent. No communication with the press. No acknowledgement to the public. If pressed, the official line was clear. Training exercises. Routine. Nothing unusual. Some of the younger men snickered nervously, muttering about UFOs, half joking to cut through the fear. But the older officers didn't laugh. Their silence was heavier. It was not the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of recognition. The silence of men who had seen something before and knew better than to speak. I overheard one pilot mutter under his breath, "Not the first time." He said it like a confession, eyes fixed on the floor, voice low enough that only I caught it. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. But I noticed others exchange glances, quick, sharp, knowing. It was as if I had stumbled into a conversation that had been happening long before I arrived. An unspoken agreement to remember without speaking. In that moment, I understood what we had witnessed was not unprecedented. It was simply the latest entry in a hidden history stretching back decades. Later, the official explanation would come, neat and dismissive. Flares dropped over the Barry Goldwater Range. But even before the words were spoken, I knew. I knew because I had been outside. I had seen it. And I knew because the men around me, for all their silence, carried the same haunted look. Flares do not glide in unison for miles across a state. They do not blot out stars. They do not stretch across the horizon like a floating city, moving with deliberation, holding formation with mathematical precision. Flares drift. They flicker. They fall. What we saw that night was structured, intelligent, deliberate. The problem was not just what we saw, but who saw it. Tens of thousands of civilians across Arizona bore witness. Doctors standing in their driveways with children. Police officers pulling their cruisers to the side of the road. Teachers, truck drivers, retirees. Families gathered in backyards. Entire neighborhoods looked up together, pointing, whispering, gasping as the massive V-shaped craft swallowed the stars above them. Some swore it stretched the length of several football fields. Others claimed it was larger than anything they could measure. Most UFO sightings are lonely, one or two people catching a glimpse of lights in isolation. Easy to dismiss. But this was different. This was collective. Countless eyes locked onto the same impossible shape, and that made the silence harder to enforce. Back inside the base, the pressure mounted. We were reminded of duty, of loyalty, of the dangers of fueling public panic. Pilots who scrambled that night returned with hollow eyes, refusing to discuss details. Some claimed they had seen nothing. Others admitted, off the record, that they had seen exactly what the civilians described but had no words for it. Files were locked away. Logs were rewritten. What had been anomalous lights in initial reports became standard training activity in the official version. The transformation was surgical. Truth stripped, sanitized, buried. What unsettled me most was the atmosphere of knowing. The older officers didn't ask questions. They didn't argue. They simply accepted the official line with weary resignation, as though they had walked this road before. I realized that for them, Phoenix was not an anomaly. It was a repetition. Another case in a pattern too vast to ignore and too dangerous to acknowledge. That realization was almost more terrifying than the lights themselves, because it meant we were not witnessing the beginning of a mystery, but a continuation of one. And it left me with a question I still cannot silence. If this has happened before, how many times has it been buried? How many witnesses silenced? How many skies rewritten by official reports until the truth dissolved into folklore? The morning after March 13th, the desert sun rose as if nothing had happened. But inside Luke Air Force Base, nothing felt the same. The air was heavy with something unspoken. Men who normally swapped jokes over coffee sat in silence, their eyes avoiding each other's. The chatter of the radios, usually background noise, seemed sharper, as though everyone was listening for a word that never came. Official orders arrived before breakfast. They were precise, unambiguous, and carried the weight of absolute authority. We were not to speculate. We were not to answer questions. We were to repeat one line only, routine training exercises. The phrase was repeated so many times it began to sound like a spell, a charm designed to erase the night before. But spells do not erase memory. I went to my debriefing later that morning. The room was small, suffocating under fluorescent lights. Two men in suits, not uniforms, sat across from me, their briefcases closed but their pens ready. They asked questions in rapid succession, like prosecutors cross-examining a witness. How many lights did you see? What was their formation? How long were they visible? Did you notice sound, vibration, propulsion? The questions were clinical, as if they weren't hearing me so much as comparing my answers to a checklist already prepared. When I asked what the lights were, the room grew colder. One of the men leaned forward, his voice low, his words deliberate. What you saw is classified. Stick to your orders. Do not speculate. Do not share. This is a matter of national security. National security. The phrase was a wall, one I was not meant climb. Later that day, the press was already circling. Civilians across Phoenix flooded news stations with calls. Some even handed over shaky VHS tapes, showing the lights gliding across the night sky. Anchors spoke with a mix of awe and nervous laughter, unsure whether they were reporting history or indulging hysteria. And then came the governor. Fife Symington stepped in front of cameras, his expression grave. He said he understood the public's concern. He said the government was investigating. For a moment, I thought he might break ranks and admit what thousands had seen. But then, with a smirk, he brought out a staffer in an oversized alien costume. The room erupted in laughter. Headlines the next day mocked the incident, reducing the collective memory of an entire state to a punchline. But I remember standing in the barracks watching the press conference. Not one of us laughed. We sat in silence, faces hard, jaws clenched. The governor had not erased what we had seen. He had ridiculed it. He had ridiculed us. Years later, when Symington finally admitted he had seen the lights too, that they were the most extraordinary thing he had ever witnessed, his confession only deepened the betrayal. He had mocked us to protect public calm, yet privately he had carried the same weight we did. The contradiction was unbearable. The truth in private, the joke in public. Meanwhile, the official explanation solidified. Illumination flares dropped during a training exercise. The Air Force repeated it with the calm confidence of a doctor prescribing a pill. But the witnesses did not waver. Families swore they had watched a massive, structured craft glide silently above their neighborhoods. Airline pilots reported lights passing beneath their planes. Police officers testified to pulling their cars to the side of the road, stepping out, and staring upward in disbelief. These were not wild-eyed dreamers. These were professionals, people with reputations, with lives built on credibility. And yet, they too were mocked. The ridicule spread like wildfire. Newspapers ran cartoons of flying saucers. Late-night comedians turned Phoenix into a punchline. Even in the base, younger men began parroting the jokes, desperate to mask their unease. But the older men stayed quiet, their silence deeper, heavier, refusing to be broken by laughter. I started to notice something else. Reports that had been filed the night before, raw, unfiltered descriptions of anomalous lights in formation, began to change. By the second day, the language had been softened. Anomalous became unusual. Formation became apparent pattern. Words stripped of their weight until nothing remained but ambiguity. It was as though the truth was being diluted one sentence at a time, rewritten until it no longer threatened anyone. But memory cannot be redacted. That night, I sat in my bunk, unable to sleep. I replayed the image again and again, the silent V blotting out the stars, the golden lights holding steady as they crossed the horizon. I told myself I had to let it go, that orders were orders. But deep down, I knew I could not. What I had seen was not routine. It was not flares. It was not a joke. It was deliberate. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it felt staged. Not staged by us, not staged by the military, but staged for us. The craft, or whatever intelligence controlled it, had not hidden itself. It had displayed itself. It wanted to be seen. The thought kept me awake until dawn, because if it wanted to be seen, then it was sending a message. The only question was, to whom? What struck me most in the weeks that followed was not the silence of the base, but the voices of the people outside it. Arizona had become a state of witnesses. The story was no longer contained in military files or briefings. It was spilling into living rooms, radio stations, and newspapers across the nation. Every night, local television stations opened their phone lines to callers. Housewives, farmers, police officers, airline pilots, all described the same thing, a massive V-shaped formation gliding silently overhead. Light steady, movement deliberate. Some told their stories with trembling voices. Others spoke with calm precision, as though reciting a memory etched into them too deeply to fade. One family filmed the lights from their backyard with a handheld camcorder. The footage was grainy, shaky, imperfect, but unmistakable. A line of glowing orbs stretched across the night sky, holding position with uncanny steadiness. News stations replayed the clip again and again. For some, it was proof. For others, it was fuel for ridicule. But for those who had seen the lights with their own eyes, it was validation. What made the Phoenix lights different from so many other incidents was not just the scale of the sighting, but the diversity of the witnesses. UFO reports often come from isolated individuals, easily dismissed as mistaken or delusional. But here, Entire neighborhoods stood together in silence, pointing at the same impossible shape blotting out the stars. Children clung to their parents' arms. Police officers pulled their cars to the roadside. Pilots flying above the desert called in their observations, confused and unnerved. When thousands of voices echo the same truth, disbelief becomes harder to sustain. And yet, disbelief was precisely what officials insisted upon. The flare explanation continued to dominate official channels. Press releases repeated the story until it became background noise. Training exercises, illumination devices, nothing unusual. But the public was not so easily convinced. UFO researchers descended on Phoenix, notebooks and cameras in hand. Some were amateurs chasing headlines, but others were methodical, disciplined, determined to sift through the noise for evidence. They collected testimonies, mapped sighting reports, and compared them against official timelines. Again and again, the data refused to align with the flare narrative. The craft had been visible for far too long. Its path had crossed too many cities. The reports were too consistent. Soon, Phoenix was no longer just a local mystery. National networks picked up the story. Nightly news anchors debated it. Late-night radio programs dedicated hours to interviews with witnesses. Newspapers across the country ran headlines like "Mystery Lights Over Arizona" and "Desert Sky Phenomenon Baffles Thousands." Some mocked, some speculated, but none ignored it. And then the comparisons began. Roswell resurfaced in headlines. Rendlesham was mentioned in quiet tones. The December night when U.S. airmen had stood in an English forest staring at a craft etched with strange symbols. Researchers noted similarities to sightings in Belgium during the early 90s, when triangular formations of lights drifted silently over towns. The pattern was undeniable. Vast, structured craft appearing in the skies, witnessed by hundreds, then dismissed by authorities. It was not just Phoenix. It was global. Inside Luke, we followed the news like anyone else, pretending not to care but secretly watching every segment, every article, every interview. We recognized the faces of disbelief mirrored in the faces of witnesses. They carried the same haunted look we did. The difference was that we had been ordered into silence while they still tried to speak. But even for them, the cost of speaking grew heavy. Some were mocked at work. Others saw their reputations questioned. A few who had initially spoken loudly to reporters withdrew into silence, as though the weight of ridicule was too much to bear. It was then that I understood ridicule was not a byproduct. It was a weapon. Mockery did what orders could not. It silenced truth. Still, not everyone retreated. Some fought harder, organizing town halls, sharing recordings, demanding explanations. They refused to let the night fade into folklore. And the more they pressed, the more it became clear. The Phoenix lights would not vanish into a footnote. They were too big, too collective, too undeniable. But I also began to feel a deeper unease. Because if the craft, or whatever intelligence controlled it, had wanted to remain hidden, it could have. It had crossed the state in silence, radar blind, unseen by instruments yet visible to human eyes. That choice, the choice to be seen, was deliberate. And I could not shake the question that haunted me then and still haunts me now. Why Phoenix? Why that night? Why so many witnesses? Was it accident? Or was it intention? An announcement written across the desert sky? The hardest part of Phoenix was not the night itself. It was the weeks and months that followed. You might think that witnessing something so vast, so undeniable, would unite people in wonder or spark a new era of curiosity. But that isn't what happened. What followed was ridicule, silence, and doubt. For those of us inside Luke Air Force Base, the event didn't end when the lights vanished. It lingered like smoke in the lungs, impossible to clear, impossible to ignore. The barracks grew heavy with unease. Meals in the mess hall turned quiet. Conversations shrank to whispers. Men who normally carried themselves with unshakable confidence now avoided eye contact, as if acknowledging what we had seen might summon it back. The younger airmen tried to laugh it off, parroting the jokes they heard on television. But the older men said little. Their silence weighed more than words ever could. For me, the nights became unbearable. Sleep rarely came, and when it did, it brought no rest. I dreamed of the formation stretching endlessly across the sky, its golden lights holding steady above me. Sometimes in those dreams the lights descended, breaking formation to surround me, until the night dissolved into blinding white. I would wake gasping, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as if I had run for miles. The silence of the craft seemed to follow me into waking life, pressing against my chest, suffocating and unseen. I tried to bury it. I focused on drills, on reports, on routine. But no matter how hard I worked, the image returned. Sharp, precise, unshakable. I could remember the exact spacing of the lights, the angle of the formation, the way stars vanished behind it. No dream carries such clarity. No flare holds such precision. Others were haunted too. One man confided in me that he hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night since March 13th. Another admitted he'd started drinking heavily just to silence the images replaying in his mind. A pilot who had scrambled that night requested a transfer within weeks. He never said why. He didn't need to. And then there were the notebooks. I began to fill them compulsively. Sketches of the formation, notes from witness reports clipped out of newspapers, maps of sighting locations, transcriptions of television interviews. At first, I told myself it was discipline, an attempt to make sense of what we had seen. But over time, I realized it was obsession. My desk became buried under clippings and diagrams. My bunk, once orderly, grew cluttered with loose sheets of paper filled with half-finished thoughts. I was no longer just a soldier. I was a recorder of something larger than myself. And still, the official story hardened. Flares. Always flares. The ridicule spread faster than the truth. Newspapers ran cartoons. Late-night hosts laughed. Even some of my neighbors outside the base smirked when the subject came up, eager to dismiss it as hysteria. That was perhaps the cruelest cut, the way disbelief infected even those who had seen it with their own eyes. Mockery became a shield, easier to carry than fear. But ridicule could not erase the damage. Trust began to fray. My faith in the chain of command, once absolute, was corroded by contradiction. I had sworn to serve, to protect, to obey. But Phoenix taught me that truth could be sacrificed for control, that ridicule could be weaponized to bury reality. If they could laugh away a craft that blotted out the stars above a city, what else could they erase? That thought was more dangerous than the lights themselves, because it meant the real battle was not between us and whatever intelligence moved silently across our skies. The real battle was between truth and the machinery built to contain it. And late at night, when sleep refused to come, I would find myself staring at the desert horizon, asking questions that still haunt me. Why Phoenix? Why reveal itself to so many? Why in such silence? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, was that night meant to show us something or to test how we would respond? Decades have passed since that night, yet the memory of Phoenix clings to me as though it happened yesterday. Time has weathered my body, but it has not dulled the image of that massive V stretching across the desert sky, blotting out the stars in its silent passage. The world around me has changed, politics, wars, technology, but the night of March 13th, 1997 remains frozen, untouched, unmovable. On anniversaries, the story resurfaces. News outlets revisit it briefly, playing the same grainy camcorder footage, interviewing the same handful of witnesses. Sometimes they treat it as a mystery, sometimes as a joke, but always as entertainment. For most, the Phoenix Lights are folklore now, a curiosity package for television specials and documentaries. But for those of us who were there, it was not entertainment. It was as real as the desert air in our lungs, as sharp as the silence pressing against our skin, as undeniable as the stars vanishing above us. In the years since, more pieces of the puzzle have surfaced. Declassified documents acknowledge unexplained aerial phenomena. Pilots, both military and civilian, have spoken more freely. The Pentagon itself has admitted to programs dedicated to studying what they now call UAPs. The ridicule is softer now, the laughter quieter, the questions louder, and yet the pattern remains. Roswell in 1947, Rendlesham in 1980, Belgium in the early 90s, Phoenix in 1997, Navy pilots off the Pacific in the 2000s. Different decades, different continents, The same story. Vast, silent craft appearing without warning, witnessed by many, dismissed officially, buried beneath ridicule. Always the same sequence. Always the same control. Sometimes I wonder if that is a true message, that the events are not isolated, but chapters in a single, unfolding book. A slow drip of revelation spread across generations, as if preparing us for something larger. Perhaps Phoenix was not meant to terrify, but to display, to show us the shape of what moves above us, to remind us, even if only for a night, that the sky is not ours. The older I become, the more I feel the weight of that silence. It is not just what we saw, but how it was buried, the laughter of a governor, the neatness of an official flare explanation, the way thousands of voices were brushed aside as if they had imagined it together. That was the real lesson of Phoenix. Not just that the phenomenon exists, but that truth itself can be rewritten. And that is why I keep my notebooks, page after page filled with sketches, clippings, fragments of memory. Not because I believe I will solve the mystery, but because I refuse to let it vanish. If silence is erasure, then memory is resistance. I still dream of that night. Sometimes the lights glide above me, steady and silent. Sometimes they descend, surrounding me in impossible brightness. Sometimes I am back inside Luke, staring at blank radar screens while the world outside cries out in disbelief. Always, I wake with the same weight in my chest, the weight of knowing that I witnessed something undeniable, and that the denial was worse than the sight itself. And now, as I look back across the decades, I find myself asking you the question I can never escape. If you had been there, if you had looked up and seen the stars vanish above you, the desert sky devoured by a craft larger than anything we can imagine, would you accept the comfort of official explanations? Would you laugh at the governor, shake your head, and move on? Or would you carry it with you, as I do, knowing that for one night the truth revealed itself, undeniable and uninvited? I cannot laugh. I cannot forget. I cannot surrender the memory. Because on March 13th, 1997, Phoenix was not just a city. It was a witness to something vast, deliberate, and unclaimed. And though decades have passed, I still believe the silence above us is not empty. It waits, patient and deliberate, for another display, another night, another city, perhaps yours. Until then, I remain what I was at night, a soldier who looked up and saw the impossible. In the days that followed the Phoenix Lights, the desert itself seemed to buzz with voices. Newspapers carried bold headlines that screamed across front pages, "Thousands see lights over Phoenix." Local television stations replayed the same shaky camcorder footage again and again, grainy images of glowing orbs stretched in a perfect V-shape against the night sky. Anchors who had never spoken the word UFO with a straight face were suddenly forced to describe what entire neighborhoods had witnessed together. The sheer scale of the testimony was overwhelming. It would have been easy to dismiss one or two isolated witnesses, but this was not one or two. This was an entire state staring skyward in unison. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, mechanics, grandmothers, children, off-duty police officers. People of every age and profession found themselves repeating the same story. They were not raving about alien abductions, nor spinning elaborate fantasies. They were calm, clear, precise. They spoke of a craft so large it blocked out stars, gliding silently, moving with a purpose that no natural phenomenon or human aircraft could explain. I remember sitting in the barracks, watching a grandmother on television. Her voice shook as she described standing on her porch, clutching her grandson's hand, both of them staring up at the massive formation as it passed overhead. Tears filled her eyes as she admitted she didn't want to believe what she had seen, but she could not deny it. Watching her, I felt something break inside me. I had been there. I had seen the same lights, the same impossible shape. And hearing her, it was as if my own voice had found its way out of her mouth. One of the most striking aspects of the days that followed was the calm precision with which witnesses described the event. These were not wild-eyed fanatics. A commercial airline pilot recounted how the formation passed silently beneath his plane, its light so steady and symmetrical he thought he was looking at a flying city. A police officer admitted pulling his cruiser to the side of the road and stepping out in disbelief as the V glided silently overhead. Teachers described entire families standing together in their driveways, speechless as the sky was consumed by the craft. Each account carried the same details. The formation was vast. Some said the size of several football fields. Others said larger than anything they could measure. The lights were fixed, not drifting, not flickering. The motion was slow, deliberate, as if the craft wanted to be seen. And above all, the silence. That eerie, suffocating silence that turned the night air heavy, as though the entire world had been muted by some unseen hand. Even local meteorologists, usually quick to dismiss such stories, began to comment. They pointed out that the winds at night were inconsistent with the official flare explanation. They reminded the public that flares drift, burn unevenly, and vanish within minutes. Yet the lights over Arizona had stretched across hundreds of miles, observed for nearly 2 hours. That alone should have been enough to demand investigation. The sheer number of voices created something rare in the world of unexplained phenomena: consensus. When thousands of unrelated people described the same thing, patterns emerged that cannot be ignored. Timelines were drawn, showing the craft's path from the Nevada border, across Prescott through Phoenix and down toward Tucson. Witness after witness confirmed the sequence, their testimonies fitting together like pieces of map too large for any one person to see alone. For us inside Luke Air Force Base, watching these testimonies was harder than anything we had experienced on duty. The truth was right there, spilling out of living rooms and broadcasts on evening news, but we were forbidden to acknowledge it. Orders were orders. Yet each time I watched a family stand in front of the camera and calmly recount what they had seen, I felt the gap between silence and truth grow wider. Some of us clipped articles in secret, folding them into our pockets or hiding them in lockers. Others pretended not to care, but I noticed their eyes linger on the television whenever a new witness appeared. It was as though we were living in two realities at once: the official reality of training exercises and flares, and the undeniable reality of thousands of voices describing exactly what we had seen with our own eyes. That dissonance gnawed at me, because unlike radar blips or classified reports, these were people, ordinary untrained civilians, yet their testimonies carried the same weight, the same haunted precision that we felt inside the base. They were telling our story for us. And still, the walls around us demanded silence. Looking back now, I realize the power of those days lay not in the lights themselves, but in the chorus of witnesses who refused to be silenced. Each voice added to the weight of the truth, pressing against the official narrative. And even though the ridicule would come, even though skeptics lined up to explain away the footage, the memory of those voices remains unshakable. Because one witness can be dismissed, two can be doubted, but thousands, entire neighborhoods, an entire state staring into the sky together, that cannot be erased. And yet, as we would soon learn, erasure is not always about destroying evidence. Sometimes, it is about burying it under layers of laughter and denial until even the witnesses themselves begin to doubt what they saw. The flare explanation arrived faster than the dust storms that sweep across the desert. Before witnesses had even finished describing what they saw, before the shaky camcorder tapes could be fully rewound, the official word was already in circulation: illumination flares, dropped during routine training exercises at the Barry Goldwater Range. It was a story designed to be clean, simple, digestible, easy for newspapers to print, easy for newscasters to repeat, easy for skeptics to latch onto. Flares drift, flare out, glow bright against the night sky. From a distance, they could look like mysterious lights. That was the narrative, and it was repeated with such mechanical precision that it felt rehearsed. But for those of us who had been there, who had seen the massive V stretch across the desert sky, the explanation was absurd. Flares do not hold formation for nearly 2 hours. They do not glide silently across hundreds of miles, vanishing and reappearing as they traverse an entire state. They do not pass beneath commercial aircraft, steady as planets, deliberate as machines. And yet, this was a story chosen for public consumption. The repetition was relentless. Press releases from military spokesmen emphasized that the flares had been dropped at the exact time witnesses claimed to see the lights. Local officials echoed the statement, reassuring the public that nothing extraordinary had occurred. Anchors on evening news smiled knowingly, their voices dripping with condescension as they explained away the phenomenon. Mystery solved, they declared. Nothing more than training exercises. Inside Luke Air Force Base, we knew better. We had heard the reports. We had seen the faces of pilots who scrambled that night, only to return shaken and silent. We had read the initial logs that described unidentified formation lights before those words were quietly replaced with flare activity. The shift in language was surgical, as though truth could be excised with a stroke of a pen. One officer I trusted pulled me aside in the hallway, his voice low, his eyes scanning the corridor to make sure no one was near. "This isn't about what happened," he said. "It's about control. They can't explain it, so they bury it. Flares are a story the public will accept." Then he walked away without another word. And that was the heart of it, acceptance. The flare explanation wasn't meant to convince those of us who saw the craft. It wasn't even meant to convince the thousands of civilians who stood under its shadow. It was meant for everyone else, for those who hadn't been there, who would hear the story secondhand, and who would gladly trade truth for comfort. But cracks appeared almost immediately. Civilian meteorologists questioned the narrative, pointing out that wind conditions at night would have scattered flares within minutes, not kept them in steady formation across miles. Some police officers openly doubted the official story, admitting off the record that what they had seen bore no resemblance to flares. Witnesses who had filmed the lights insisted their footage showed a structured formation, not drifting sparks. And yet, the official line held firm. Why? Because it was repeated enough times. Again and again, until the words themselves carried authority, no matter how flimsy the evidence behind them. That was when I first began to understand the machinery of denial. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't improvised. It was disciplined, deliberate, and frighteningly efficient. First, issue a simple explanation. Something mundane, easy to grasp, even if it doesn't fit. Second, repeat it endlessly, through every channel, until it becomes background noise. Third, allow skepticism and ridicule to do the rest. Mock anyone who resists, reduce them to caricatures, and let public opinion smother the truth under laughter. It worked. I watched neighbors who had stood in their driveways, mouths open in disbelief, begin to hesitate when asked about the lights. Maybe they were flares, they said, their voices uncertain, as though already doubting their own eyes. I saw television stations cut away from serious witness testimony to run lighthearted segments that mocked alien enthusiasts. I read newspapers that paired sober descriptions of the event with cartoons of flying saucers. And in that transformation, the truth was not erased. It was distorted, twisted into something easier to dismiss. For those of us inside the base, that distortion was almost more painful than the silence we had been ordered to keep. We could endure silence. We had lived through secrecy before. But watching the truth not just buried but ridiculed, watching witnesses mocked for their courage to speak, that was unbearable. I began to suspect that the flare story had been ready long before Phoenix. That somewhere in the machinery of power, explanations like these were pre-packaged, waiting for the next event, waiting for the next night when the sky itself would betray its secrets. And if that was true, then Phoenix was not an accident. It was a rehearsal, another step in a pattern that had stretched across decades. Even now, I ask myself, when the sky shows us something undeniable and the officials hand us something easy, which would you choose? The comfort of the explanation or the weight of the truth? Ridicule arrived like a second wave, more devastating in its own way than the lights themselves. If the first night had stunned Arizona into silence, the days that followed taught people how to laugh. And laughter, I would come to learn, can bury truth deeper than any official document ever could. Late-night comedians were the first to pounce. I remember sitting in the barracks as one host on national television joked about rush hour in alien airspace, drawing roars of laughter from the studio audience. Another cracked wise about Phoenix residents confusing UFOs with the world's largest pizza delivery. The jokes came fast, relentless, each one chipping away at the seriousness of what had happened. Soon, political cartoonists joined the chorus. Newspapers that had printed sober headlines only a day before now filled their opinion pages with drawings of little green men clogging Arizona freeways. Radio hosts mocked callers who swore they had seen the lights, talking over them against sound effects of flying saucers crashing into cacti. The entire state became the butt of a national joke, and the impact was immediate. People who had spoken openly on camera the first night began to retreat. Some stopped returning reporters' calls. Others, one so certain of what they had seen, began to second-guess themselves. Maybe it was flares, they muttered, their voices heavy with doubt. Not because the evidence had changed, but because ridicule made certainty harder to carry. That was the weapon at work. Ridicule was not about disproving. It was about silencing. Because who wants to risk their reputation, their career, their friendships, by standing against a tidal wave of laughter? I saw the damage firsthand. One teacher, who had spoken passionately about seeing the massive V with her students, later admitted to me privately that she wished she had kept her mouth shut. Parents had teased her. Colleagues rolled their eyes. Her credibility, built over decades, was suddenly fragile, all because she had dared to tell the truth about what she saw in the sky. Even within the base, the ridicule infected us. Younger airmen, desperate to avoid the stigma, parroted the jokes they heard outside, smirking about space tourists whenever the subject came up. But behind their laughter, I recognized the same unease I felt, the same haunted look in her eyes when the jokes faded and silence returned. They had seen it too. They just feared being mocked more than being silent. The cruelty of it was in its simplicity. Ridicule didn't have to answer questions. It didn't have to prove anything. It only had to make the truth embarrassing to hold. And so the narrative shifted. The lights were no longer a phenomenon witnessed by thousands. They became a punchline. Phoenix, for a time, was not a city of witnesses but a city of fools, at least in the way the rest of the nation saw it. But not everyone laughed. A councilwoman, Frances Barwood, broke ranks with the chorus. When hundreds of constituents flooded her office with calls, she did what elected officials are supposed to do. She asked for answers. In a council meeting, she publicly requested an investigation. For that, she was ridiculed mercilessly. Headlines painted her as naive, a dreamer chasing fantasies. Her political career never recovered, but she refused to recant, reminding anyone who would listen that thousands of credible people had seen the same thing. Her courage struck me deeply. She had no uniform, no clearance, no chain of command forcing her silence. Yet she bore the same weight we did, the weight of ridicule, simply for refusing to deny what was undeniable. Meanwhile, ufologists from across the country poured into Arizona. Some were opportunists chasing headlines, but others came with discipline. They gathered testimony, cross-referenced timelines, measured distances, interviewed pilots and police officers. They treated the case with the seriousness it deserved, even as the mainstream world laughed. And slowly, beneath the noise of jokes and cartoons, a quiet resistance began to form. Witnesses who refused to back down. Researchers who built detailed reports. Ordinary people who held on to their memories despite the pressure to forget. Watching all of this, I realized something chilling. Ridicule wasn't just a reaction. It was part of the plan. I had seen it before in whispers about Roswell, in rumors about Rendlesham, in old clippings about Kecksburg. Always the same pattern. A shocking event, followed by a simple official explanation, followed by a tidal wave of mockery to ensure that even those who believe would hesitate to speak. And Phoenix fit that pattern perfectly. The night of March 13th had given us a spectacle too large to erase. But ridicule could do what silence could not. It could bury the truth in laughter, suffocating it until even those who knew better chose not to speak. And that, I realized, was the real danger of Phoenix. Not the lights, not the silence, but the laughter. Because laughter, wielded as a weapon, can turn truth into fiction. And once truth becomes a joke, who dares defend it? While most of the nation laughed, a small group refused to let the Phoenix lights fade into the background noise of late-night jokes and skeptical editorials. These were the voices that carried the story forward, not because it was easy, but because silence felt like betrayal. One of the first was Councilwoman Frances Barwood. At a Phoenix City Council meeting, surrounded by colleagues who smirked at the very mention of UFOs, she did what few others dared. She asked for an investigation. Hundreds of constituents had flooded her office with calls, describing what they had seen. Families, police officers, pilots, people with no reason to lie. She couldn't ignore them, so she spoke. The response was brutal. The press mocked her. Cartoonists painted her as a wide-eyed dreamer chasing alien fantasies. Political opponents dismissed her as unserious, unfit for office. Her career was effectively derailed by a single act of honesty. And yet, she stood firm. Again and again, she repeated her point. Thousands of credible witnesses could not be ignored. They had seen something extraordinary, and to pretend otherwise was a disservice not just to them, but to the public trust. I remember watching her on television, her voice steady despite the ridicule. Something about her courage struck me deeply. Here was a woman with no uniform, no classified clearance, no military chain of command. Yet she bore the same burden we did, the weight of knowing, the weight of refusing to deny what was undeniable. Her bravery echoed louder than the laughter. She was not alone. Ufologists, often dismissed as fringe, descended on Phoenix in droves. Some came chasing headlines, but others brought rigor. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses, building a body of testimony too large to dismiss. They created detailed timelines, mapping the craft's path from Nevada across Arizona, comparing independent reports that aligned with eerie precision. Some measured burn marks on the desert floor. Others analyzed the shaky camcorder footage frame by frame, noting how the lights maintained fixed relative positions. Their reports contrasted sharply with the official story. The flare narrative simply didn't hold up under scrutiny. The timing was wrong. The distances were impossible. Meteorological data contradicted the claim that drifting flares could have held formation for so long. Witnesses described the craft passing silently overhead, blotting out stars. Flares couldn't do that. And then there were the pilots. Some spoke only off the record, but their testimonies leaked nonetheless. Civilian aviators recounted how the V-shaped formation had passed beneath their planes, larger than anything they had ever seen. A few military pilots admitted quietly to colleagues that they had scrambled that night, only to encounter the same impossible craft described by civilians. Their voices were cautious, measured, but unshakable. Piece by piece, an alternate narrative began to take shape. Not in official halls of power, but in living rooms, town halls, and small conferences where researchers and witnesses gathered. It was a narrative rooted in testimony, in consistency, in persistence. And though the mainstream laughed, the persistence of these voices kept the memory of March 13th, 1997 alive. For those of us inside Luke Air Force Base, the existence of that resistance was both comforting and painful. Comforting, because it meant we were not alone. Painful, because they could say what we could not. We clipped their articles in secret, read their reports in silence, and wondered how long they could last against the tide of ridicule. Some journalists joined the resistance too. Not all, but a few. Local reporters who refused to let the story die. They interviewed witnesses with respect, not mockery. They asked tough questions about the flare explanation, pointing out its contradictions. Their voices were quieter than the laughter, but they carried a different weight. And then there were the ordinary citizens, families who refused to change their stories, police officers who admitted, years later, that they had seen the lights too, people who held on to camcorder tapes, preserving shaky footage that would one day become some of the most important visual evidence of the event. They weren't researchers or politicians. They were simply witnesses who refused to surrender the truth to ridicule. Their persistence mattered. Without them, Phoenix would have been swallowed whole by silence and laughter. Instead, it became one of the most documented, most widely witnessed, and most enduring UFO events in modern history. Even now, decades later, their courage stands as a reminder. That truth does not survive on its own. It survives because someone chooses to carry it, even when it costs them their reputation, their career, their peace of mind. And I wonder now, as I wondered then, if you'd been one of those witnesses, if you had seen the massive V blot out the stars above you, would you have spoken, knowing laughter and ridicule awaited? Or would you have remained silent, clinging to safety while the truth slipped away? For some, the answer was silence. For others, it was laughter. But for a few, just enough to matter, the answer was courage. And because of them, the Phoenix Lights were never truly buried. As the years passed, the Phoenix Lights refused to fade. They lingered not only in the memories of those who witnessed them, but in the growing body of global reports that pointed to a chilling pattern. What happened over Arizona on March 13th, 1997, was not an isolated anomaly. It was part of a tapestry stretching across decades and continents, woven with silence, ridicule, and glimpses of the impossible. Look far enough back, and the pattern is undeniable. In 1947, Roswell, New Mexico gave us the archetype. A crash in the desert, strange debris, rumors of bodies. For decades, officials dismissed it as nothing more than a weather balloon, while witnesses who had handled the wreckage swore otherwise. Roswell became the cautionary tale, the moment when the truth was buried under ridicule and sealed in vaults of secrecy. In 1980, Rendlesham Forest in Suffolk, England, American Airmen stationed at RAF Woodbridge reported a triangular craft, symbols etched into its surface, lights darting through the trees. Their testimonies mirrored our own. Silence in the forest, a craft that defied description, orders to remain silent. The official story dismissed it as misidentified lights from a nearby lighthouse. The pattern repeated. In Belgium, between 1989 and 1990, thousands of civilians reported black, triangular craft gliding silently over towns and villages. Police officers confirmed the sightings. Even radar operators tracked them. Once again, official explanations failed to account for the sheer scale of the event. And once again, ridicule softened the edges until it became a curiosity, not a revelation. And then Phoenix, 1997. Different skies, different continents, different decades. Always the same. Triangular formations, massive craft, silent flight, thousands of witnesses. Always the same response. Denial, mockery, dismissal. I began to suspect that the similarities were no coincidence, that what we witnessed was not random, but part of a deliberate pattern, whether by those behind the craft or by those who worked to contain the truth, perhaps both. The thought is unsettling, but impossible to shake. What if the lights over Phoenix were not just a visitation, but a test? A demonstration not of power, but of perception, to see how we would react, to see whether truth could survive not just denial, but ridicule. If that was the case, the results were clear. The majority accepted the easy explanation. Flares. Always flares. A handful resisted, carrying the truth forward, but at great personal cost. Careers ruined. Reputations mocked. Families divided. The message was not only in the sky, it was in the aftermath. And so, the question remains, why here? Why Phoenix? Why in front of thousands? Under the open desert sky, visible to anyone willing to look up? Was it an accident of geography? Or was it deliberate, part of a sequence designed to unfold slowly, across decades, across continents, giving humanity just enough to glimpse, never enough to grasp? Even now, I cannot say. What I can say is this. The Phoenix lights did not vanish. They remain etched into memory, into testimony, into the growing chorus of voices across the world who have seen the same impossible craft. And each time the laughter fades, each time secrecy falters, the pattern grows clearer. We are not dealing with isolated incidents. We are dealing with chapters in a story larger than any one nation, any one military, any one lifetime. A story written across the skies of Roswell, Rendlesham, Belgium, Phoenix, and countless places in between. And if the story is deliberate, then it carries a message. Perhaps the message is simple. We are here. Or perhaps it is a question. Are you ready to see us? I often wonder which answer frightens me more. Because as much as I want the truth revealed, I know the cost of knowing. The night over Phoenix did not just shake our understanding of the sky. It fractured our faith in authority, in security, in certainty itself. To admit the reality of what we saw is to admit that the world we thought we controlled is not ours to command. And so, I leave the question with you. If you had been there on March 13th, 1997, if you had looked up and seen the stars vanish behind a craft so massive, so silent, so undeniable, would you have chosen comfort or truth? Would you have laughed with the governor's press conference, or stood with the councilwoman mocked for asking questions? Would you have doubted your own eyes, or trusted them even when the world told you not to? I know my answer. I will carry it until my last breath. The Phoenix lights were not a flare, not a trick of the sky, not a collective illusion. They were a revelation. And perhaps one day, when the pattern completes itself, the rest of the world will understand what some of us already know. The silence above us is not empty. It waits. Patient, deliberate, unblinking. It waits for the next night. It waits for the next sky. And when it comes again, the only question will be, will you see it? In the weeks that followed, the Phoenix lights refused to fade from conversation. What began as a local mystery confined to a desert state became a subject of national fascination, debated in living rooms, reported on evening broadcasts, dissected in radio talk shows, and even mocked on late-night comedy monologues. It was everywhere, inescapable, as though the nation itself had been thrust into a conversation it was never prepared to have. The footage, grainy, shaky, recorded by camcorders in driveways and suburban streets, seemed to play endlessly. Rows of glowing orbs fixed in a precise V-shaped formation hovered against the night sky, their stillness more unsettling than motion could ever have been. It wasn't just lights, it was geometry, it was intent, and it was undeniable. Each replay only deepened the sense that what had passed above Arizona was not a fluke of perception, not a misidentification, but something extraordinary. For every official who repeated the word flares, there were dozens, hundreds of citizens who stood their ground, shaking their heads, voices steady, repeating over and over, "That's not what I saw." They came from every walk of life. Doctors who spent their lives trusting science. Pilots who knew the sky as well as anyone alive. Teachers, retirees, police officers, truck drivers, families with children. Their testimonies aligned with a consistency that defied coincidence. And what united them was not hysteria or flights of imagination. It was the simplicity of their words. They didn't talk about abductions or fantastical encounters. They didn't frame it in the language of science fiction. They just described what was right before their eyes. A massive, silent craft blotting out the stars above Arizona, moving with a deliberate precision that no flare or conventional aircraft could mimic. Inside Luke Air Force Base, the weight of those testimonies hit differently. For us, it was not a story told from the outside. It was a mirror of our own thoughts, our own memories of that night, repeated back to us by strangers we had never met. Each civilian voice echoed what we ourselves had felt, but could not say aloud. And in that echo was an uncomfortable truth. We were not witnesses on the fringes. We were part of the machinery tasked with controlling the story, and control, not truth, was the mission. The signs of that control revealed themselves immediately. Files that should have been accessible suddenly required higher clearance. Requests for reports that had once been routine were marked unavailable. Logs disappeared into restricted archives. Conversations that used to spill openly in the corridors shrank into whispers behind closed doors. Words themselves seemed to bend under pressure, stripped of honesty until only scripted phrases remained. Military spokesmen delivered the same rehearsed lines again and again. Training exercise, no cause for alarm, nothing unusual detected. But inside those same walls, behind those same closed doors, the tone shifted. I remember overhearing a pilot in a quiet hangar, his voice lower than a prayer, confessing to a colleague that what he had seen that night could not be compared to any flare he had ever encountered. His tone was not panicked. It was steady, deliberate, as if each word was a stone he was forced to carry. Another pilot, speaking half to himself, admitted that jets had been scrambled, not for drills, not for tests, but to pursue something. And whatever it was, it had outrun them with an ease that left no room for denial. Their words were reluctant, weighed down with the knowledge that even to admit such things privately was dangerous. Yet they were undeniable. That was the unbearable contradiction. On the record, flares. Off the record, something impossible. The two realities ran parallel, never allowed to touch. One for the public neatly packaged, ready for ridicule. The other, a raw truth too dangerous to speak aloud. It did not take me long to understand that the official explanation was not crafted to clarify. It was constructed to bury. And still, the story spread. Headlines stretched from New York to Los Angeles, beyond the American border, into European newspapers. London wrote about it. Paris speculated. Tokyo whispered. The footage, though grainy, carry across oceans, across cultures, igniting the same debate in every language. What was this thing that drifted silently across the desert sky, seen by so many, denied by so few in power? The Phoenix Lights were no longer a regional curiosity. They had grown into something larger, something harder to contain. They were no longer just a mystery hovering above Arizona. They had become part of a greater question, one that reached far beyond the state, far beyond the United States itself. And the question that haunted me most was simple, almost childlike in its clarity, but devastating in its implications. What exactly is our government so afraid of admitting? Was it that they did not know what the craft was? Or was it that they knew and feared what that knowledge would mean for us? The silence offered no answers, only wait. And as each day passed, I realized more clearly, the Phoenix Lights were not just about the sky. They were about control. They were about the lengths to which power will go, not confront the unknown, but to ensure the rest of us never dare to look at it too closely. As researchers pored over witness statements, timelines, and grainy footage, a troubling pattern began to surface. Phoenix, we realized, was not unique. Phoenix was not alone. It was part of something older, something global, something that whispered through decades of secrecy and denial. Patterns emerged like ink bleeding through paper. They were never shouted. They were always whispered, always buried beneath official lines and convenient explanations. Yet, when you laid them side by side, a disturbing choreography became undeniable. Phoenix was simply the latest entry in a long, carefully managed sequence. Take 1980, for instance. Rendlesham Forest, in England. U.S. Air Force personnel stationed there reported strange lights descending into the trees. What they found was not a trick of the eye, not a flare, not a star. It was a craft, triangular, metallic, hovering silently above the forest floor. Some men swore they touched it. They described the heat radiating from its hull, the texture of its surface, and most memorably, the symbols etched along its side, not markings of human origin, but glyphs geometric, foreign, carved with precision that felt alive. One man later confessed that the symbols seemed to burn into his mind, as though memory itself was branded, and yet the official explanation was simple, dismissive, even insulting. A lighthouse. Nothing more. Just a trick of perspective. A simple mistake made by trained officers who suddenly, we were told, could not tell the difference between a centuries-old light tower and a hovering craft the size of a house. But those who had been there refused to lie. Their accounts were consistent. Their fear was real. Their reputations were scarred for life. Rendlesham became a scar too, not only on the witnesses, but on the truth itself. Go further back. 1965, Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. Residents reported a fiery object streaking across the sky, ending in a crash deep in the woods. At first, locals thought it was a meteor, but when they reached the site, they found something far stranger. Witnesses described a bell-shaped object, metallic, partly buried in the ground, with markings that did not resemble any language they had ever seen. Before long, soldiers arrived, not in days, not in hours. Within minutes, troops flooded the small town, sealing off the woods. By nightfall, an object was carted away on the back of a flatbed truck under heavy guard. Officially, a meteor, but meteors are not loaded onto trucks and driven away under tarps. Meteors are not surrounded by soldiers wielding rifles. The secrecy itself betrayed the lie. And then, of course, Roswell, the cornerstone, the story that refuses to die. July 1947. At first, the U.S. Army issued a press release stating clearly that a flying disc had been recovered. Imagine the way that phrase in 1947, a time when the term UFO had not yet entered public consciousness. For one brief day, the truth seemed to be acknowledged. But just as quickly, the story was buried. The press release retracted. The explanation reshaped into a weather balloon. Witnesses silenced. Debris locked away. Roswell became the blueprint, the manual by which all future incidents would be handled. Different decades, different continents, different governments. And yet, the choreography was always the same. Step 1, witnesses silenced. Careers destroyed. Reputations ridiculed. Pilots called unreliable. Civilians painted as hysterical. Step 2, evidence denied. Photographs confiscated. Soil samples missing. Radar logs misfiled. Testimonies lost in bureaucratic archives never to be opened. Step 3, official stories that strained belief but carried the authority of the state. Weather balloons, meteors, lighthouses, swamp gas, anything but what the eyes of hundreds or thousands had actually seen. The pattern was meticulous, almost rehearsed, and the more I studied, the more disturbing it became. Phoenix was not an isolated rupture in reality. It was a chapter, just one among dozens, maybe hundreds, already written in invisible ink. We weren't watching history repeat itself. We were living inside a script written long before we were born, a script carefully managed, carefully revised, carefully enforced across generations. That thought unsettled me more than the craft itself. Seeing a giant V-shaped formation blot out the stars was terrifying enough, but realizing it was not unique, that others before me had seen the impossible and been silenced, was worse. Because if Phoenix was only one page, then how many other pages had been written and buried before us? How many witnesses had carried their truth to the grave, their voices drowned in ridicule and denial? And more chilling still, how many pages remain unwritten, waiting for us, waiting for the next chapter in this ongoing story we're not supposed to read? I began to wonder if ridicule itself was the strategy. Not merely denial, not simply secrecy, but deliberate mockery, wielded like a blade. Think about it. Fear is powerful, yes. Fear can make people freeze. Fear can even make them fight. But laughter? Laughter is stronger. Laughter isolates. A frightened witness may cry out, may demand answers, may cling to their conviction. But a ridiculed witness? They fall silent. They retreat into themselves. They stop talking. Because who wants to be the punchline of a nation? It was everywhere. Late-night comedians turned the Phoenix Lights into fodder for monologues, comparing the formation of orbs to alien traffic jams over the desert sky. Editorial cartoons depicted flying saucers hovering above freeways, beaming up cattle or abducting tourists with a slapstick absurdity that trivialized the real reports. Even the governor of Arizona himself staged a press conference that would become infamous. Instead of acknowledging the gravity of thousands of testimonies, he brought out a staffer in a cheap alien costume. Reporters laughed. Cameras rolled. The image went out across the world. The leader of the state turning an event that terrified its citizens into a joke. The message was simple, unmistakable, and devastating. If you believe what you saw, you are a fool. And in that moment, something clicked for me. Ridicule wasn't an accident. It wasn't a cultural reflex of skepticism. It was a weapon, a strategy, a tool sharpened over decades of practice. Because once something becomes a joke, no serious conversation can survive around it. Once the punchline is established, the truth is buried not under chains, not under threats, not even under fear, but under laughter. And perhaps, in its subtlety, that is the most effective cover of all. A silenced witness can still whisper. A threatened witness can still resist. But a witness who has been made into a clown? Their words are lost before they are even spoken. What the officials did not calculate, however, was the sheer scale of Phoenix. It is one thing to mock a handful of isolated individuals, farmers in rural fields, truck drivers alone on the highway, or a pilot whose testimony can be written off as fatigue. It is quite another to mock thousands of citizens, professionals, families, teachers, law enforcement officers, pilots, all describing the same thing at the same time across an entire state. And yet, they tried. Editorials poured out, labeling it mass hysteria. Psychologists appeared on television, explaining the power of suggestion. Military spokesmen calmly repeated the flare narrative, but the witnesses did not dissolve so easily. They refused to be erased. Their voices, multiplied by thousands, rang louder than the laughter. Because ridicule may silence a few, it may bury a dozen. But thousands of eyes cannot all be mistaken. Thousands of voices cannot all be laughed out of existence. The Phoenix Lights refused to vanish. They refused to be forgotten. Because truth, when carried by so many, has a gravity that mockery cannot fully erase. And that realization carried with it a darker implication. If ridicule had been weaponized before, and it clearly had, then how many truths had already been suffocated by laughter? How many Roswells, how many Rendleshams, how many unspoken nights of terror had been reduced to punchlines until the witnesses themselves began to doubt their own memories? The Phoenix Lights showed the cracks in that strategy. The ridicule was relentless, but the truth lingered, stubborn and immovable. Because when an entire population looks up and sees the same sky swallowed by the same impossible craft, no amount of laughter can make them forget. Some of those witnesses began to fight back. They were not content to let the night be reduced to a punchline or a line in an official report stamped with the word flares. They refused to have their memories rewritten by a press conference or their courage mocked by editorial cartoons. For them, the Phoenix Lights were not a curiosity. They were a wound. And wounds demand truth if they are ever to heal. Citizens across Arizona formed grassroots groups almost overnight. Some were ordinary families who had stood in their driveways and watched the impossible glide silently over their rooftops. Others were professionals, teachers, doctors, police officers, who carried the weight of credibility with them. They organized community meetings in school gyms, public halls, and even living rooms, piecing together fragments of testimony like detectives solving a crime. Freedom of Information Act requests began to flood government offices. Citizens demanded radar logs, flight records, military communication transcripts. They wanted accountability, not ridicule. They wanted their government to acknowledge what their eyes had already confirmed. Most of those requests were denied. Some were returned with pages so heavily redacted they were nothing but black ink. But the act of filing them mattered. It was defiance in the face of silence. It was resistance. Ufologists, long dismissed as hobbyists or fantasists, suddenly became archivists of history. They compiled timelines with almost military precision. They mapped testimonies across Arizona, cross-referencing each account, eliminating inconsistencies, and finding the points where stories converged. Their charts trace a craft's deliberate journey, entering Arizona from the Nevada border, passing over Prescott, where witnesses described it as massive and silent, then moving slowly through Phoenix, blotting out the stars above neighborhoods filled with families, and finally gliding down toward Tucson before vanishing into the desert night. The path was undeniable, the witnesses credible, the footage damning. And what made it most unshakable was the sheer diversity of those who testified. They were not a single demographic. They were not all believers, not all UFO enthusiasts. Many of them had never even considered the phenomenon before that night. But their stories aligned with precision that could not be staged. Even hardened skeptics, confronted with a mountain of testimony, were forced to admit the scale of the Phoenix Lights made it unique in modern history. Inside the military, though, the silence only deepened. Orders came down with greater intensity. Conversations grew clipped, guarded. The very air seemed heavier, as though the truth itself was being smothered by an invisible hand. I could feel its weight pressing on those who had stood beside me that night, the men who had seen the same sky, erased by a shape too vast to deny. One airman transferred within months. Officially, it was a routine reassignment. But those who knew him understood the truth. He could not carry the burden of silence any longer. He had begun to fray at the edges, haunted by memories that could not be spoken. Silence became his enemy, and it chased him from the base like a shadow. Another confided in me quietly, his voice low, his eyes downcast. He admitted that he had told his family what he had seen, desperate to unload the memory, desperate to be believed. But instead of comfort, he met only doubt and ridicule. They laughed nervously, told him he must have been mistaken, that he had misread the night. The pain in his voice when he told me this was sharper than any physical wound. He had not only been denied the right to speak the truth, he had been denied the right to be believed. And that is the cruelest weapon of all. Not the craft itself, not the lights that drift silently across the sky, but the silence imposed afterward. Silence that corrodes from within. Silence that isolates. Silence that turns comrades into strangers and memories into burdens. Because silence erodes the soul. It was no longer about the craft that appeared over Arizona. It was about control, about erasing voices, about rewriting reality, about forcing men and women to swallow the impossible and pretend it had never happened. And in that erasure, in that imposed quiet, lay a cruelty far greater than the sight of the unknown. Because to see the impossible is one kind of shock, but to be told you must never speak of it, that your voice is worthless, that your memory is a joke, that is something deeper. That is a wound that does not heal. That is the strategy of silence. And for those of us who lived it, the silence never truly ended. It only spread, filling the spaces where truth should have been, reminding us each day that the greatest weapon against truth is not denial, not even fear, but enforced quiet. A quiet that makes you doubt yourself. A quiet that turns truth into poison. That night, the craft left, but the silence stayed. I often ask myself, if you'd stood where we stood that night, your boots in the Arizona dust, your eyes staring up at a sky consumed by something too vast to comprehend, what would you have done? Would you have obeyed the order to remain silent, swallowing your words and locking away the memory as if it had never existed? Or would you have risked everything, your career, your reputation, perhaps even your freedom, to tell the world what you saw with your own eyes? For me, the choice was torment. The order was clear. Say nothing. Deny. Deflect. Repeat the line. Flares. And I obeyed. Outwardly, at least. I said nothing publicly. I went about my duties, signed my papers, wore the uniform, and performed the role expected of me. But inside, I carried the weight of that night like a stone pressed against my chest. The memory of the endless V stretching across the Arizona sky lived inside me, sharp as broken glass, refusing to fade no matter how many years passed. And with each year, as time marched forward, I watched the same pattern repeat itself again and again, as though the Phoenix Lights were not an anomaly but a chapter in an ongoing book. Different names, different places, but the same choreography every time. In 2004, Navy pilots off the coast of California reported what would later become infamous as the Tic Tac incident. White, capsule-shaped craft, moving at speeds no jet could match, accelerating and stopping in ways that broke every law of physics we knew. Radar confirmed what their eyes saw. Infrared footage captured the impossible movements. Commanders listened to pilots. Seasoned men with thousands of flight hours described something beyond comprehension. And years later, when those videos finally surfaced, the Pentagon itself confirmed they were authentic. For a moment, it felt as though the wall of silence had cracked. For a moment, the truth seemed ready to break through. And yet, even then, the same choreography played out. The denials came. The ridicule followed. Talking heads on television dismissed the footage as optical illusions, as glitches in radar, as overactive imaginations. The witnesses, once again, were made into curiosities. The silence was enforced. The Phoenix Lights were not unique. They were not a one-time event to be archived and forgotten. They were part of a tapestry stretching across decades, woven from the same threads. Secrecy, ridicule, silence. A tapestry so carefully managed that most of the world never sees in full. Each event is treated as isolated, each witness mocked as mistaken. But when you look at them together, Rendlesham, Kecksburg, Roswell, Phoenix, the tic-tac, you see the pattern emerge with brutal clarity. And that realization chilled me more deeply than the sight of the craft itself. Because patterns do not emerge from chaos by accident. Patterns emerge from control. And control means intent. Someone, somewhere, has been orchestrating not just the secrecy, but the ridicule. Not just the denials, but the silence. It took me years to understand, but when I finally did, the truth hit with the force of revelation. The truth is not being hidden because it is unknown. The truth is being hidden because it is known. Known in detail. Known in archives buried so deep they may never see the light. Known by officials who sign their names to denials in public while whispering their fears in private. And that, perhaps, is the greatest secret of all. That we are not dealing with ignorance, but with knowledge so profound, so destabilizing, that those in power had decided it must never reach us unfiltered, that they would rather bury the truth beneath ridicule and silence than risk the world confronting what lies beyond our skies. Because if the truth were ever admitted, not just hinted at, not just leaked, But admitted, it would shatter the illusions that hold our societies together. It would strip away the comforting lie that we are in control of the skies, that our governments are guardians of every secret, that our militaries can defend against anything that comes. And once that illusion is gone, what replaces it? I do not have the answer. I only know that I stood beneath a sky devoured by a silent craft, and that silence has followed me ever since. The greatest secret is not that we are being visited. The greatest secret is that those who know enough to hide it. It has been more than 2 decades since that night, and yet the phoenix lights still burn in memory as if they have been carved into the heavens themselves. Some memories fade with time. Faces blur, voices soften, details dissolve into the misty years. But not this one. This one remains sharp, unyielding, almost luminous in the darkness of recollection. Time has changed so much around us. The skyline of Phoenix rising higher with glass towers, neighborhoods sprawling further into the desert. The faces of those who were young now weathered by age, the endless churn of political promises and shifting winds of leadership. But one thing has remained immovable. The silence of March 13th, 1997. A silence that lingers like a living presence, a shadow that is never lifted. A silence so loud that it sometimes drowns out even the very memory it was meant to suppress. That night, thousands of us looked upward, and the sky itself changed. For the public, what unfolded became legend, almost myth. Say the words Phoenix Lights. Today, in any gathering in Arizona, and you will see people nod knowingly, their eyes carrying the faint glimmer of remembrance. To some, it is retold like a campfire ghost story, something half-remembered and embroidered by years of rumor. To others, it is an anecdote of pride. I was there, they say, as though surviving that night conferred a kind of secret initiation. And still others hold it quietly, speaking of it rarely, as if even naming it aloud risks awakening something best left undisturbed. The images, replayed endlessly on televisions and documentaries on online forums, are by now iconic. The shaky grain of camcorder footage capturing a formation of lights fixed in a perfect V, suspended silently against the black of the desert sky. The geometry was too precise, the stillness too deliberate, the silence too absolute. It was not simply light. It was architecture. It was intent. And no matter how often those few seconds of footage are shown, no matter how often they're analyzed, the weight of what they capture remains unbearable. Something vast, silent, and otherworldly, gliding above the people of Arizona. It has been dissected at conferences, debated by scholars, laughed at by skeptics, defended by witnesses. But for those of us in uniform that night, the ones who felt our boots press into the tarmac of Luke Air Force Base as we tilted our heads back and stared up into a sky, consumed by something too immense to measure, it was never legend. It was never rumor. It was not theory or speculation or a matter of belief. It was reality. Cold, undeniable, shattering reality. A reality that, no matter how many years pass, no matter how many explanations are offered, has never been erased. The official line, of course, has never shifted. Flares. Military training. Nothing extraordinary. A story repeated so often it begins to acquire the cadence of truth, at least to those who weren't there. But repetition does not create reality. Every witness I have ever spoken to still shakes their head when that word is uttered. Flares. They laugh bitterly, or they grow silent, or their eyes harden, because flares do not glide over an entire state. Flares do not move with geometric precision. Flares do not hover with a silence that feels like pressure in your chest. Flares do not blot out the constellations, erasing the familiar patterns of the night sky with a presence so enormous that even the stars retreat from view. Flares fall. That night, nothing fell. Something moved. Something massive. Something purposeful. It drifted slowly, almost ceremonially, as though it wanted to be seen but not understood, as though it was less an accident and more a demonstration. That was a paradox that was born that night. What we saw was undeniable, yet the very institutions tasked with defending truth, with preserving the safety of citizens, were the first to deny it. What could not be hidden was buried instead beneath words. And for those of us who had stood there, eyes straining upward, the denial was almost as disorienting as the sight itself. Inside Luke Air Force Base, The contradiction was unbearable. Outwardly, the script was simple: routine training, illumination flares, nothing extraordinary. It was the same sentence delivered in every briefing, every press interaction, every carefully worded statement. But within the base, within the hangars, the command rooms, the low-lit offices where voices fell into whispers, the truth bled through. I remember overhearing one pilot I respected deeply, seasoned, calm, a man with a chest full of ribbons, a man who had flown combat sorties overseas. Leaning close to a colleague in the corner of a hangar, his voice was lower than a prayer. He admitted that what he had seen that night was unlike anything in his decades of flying. Not Soviet, not experimental, not flares. Something else. Something he had no words for. Another officer, speaking half to himself, confessed that jets had been scrambled, not for drills, not for exercises, but to pursue something. And whatever it was, it moved beyond them with an ease that defied comprehension. It didn't evade pursuit. It rendered pursuit meaningless. To chase it was to chase a shadow, an echo, a thing untouchable. Their words were not panicked. They were not wild or frantic. They were calm, deliberate, as though each word was weighted with the risk of speaking aloud. These were not men prone to fantasy. These were not hysterics. They were soldiers, pilots, professionals, and their confessions, though hushed, were undeniable. And yet, officially, nothing happened. That was a contradiction we lived inside. Two realities, running side by side, never allowed to meet. The public reality, flares, training exercises, nothing unusual. The private reality, something impossible, undeniable, but forbidden to be spoken. Two versions of history, one scripted, one lived. And in that fracture, in that unbearable silence between what was seen and what was said, the Phoenix Lights transformed from event into something larger. A wound on memory, a wound on truth, a wound that, even now, decades later, still refuses to heal. If denial was the first tool, then ridicule was the second, and perhaps the sharper one. Denial can be resisted. A frightened witness can still shout. A frightened witness can still demand answers, cling to conviction, and point to the sky. Fear, after all, sharpens a voice. But ridicule? Ridicule is quieter. It seeps in like poison. A ridiculed witness doesn't shout louder. They retreat. They stop speaking. They begin to doubt themselves. They turn into the butt of the joke, a caricature, and once that happens, no one listens to the punchline. I began to wonder if ridicule itself was not just a reaction, not just an accident of culture, but the strategy all along, a deliberate tool, a weapon wielded with precision, honed over decades of practice. Because laughter, unlike fear, doesn't simply silence, it erases. Fear leaves scars. Laughter leaves nothing. The Phoenix Lights were a perfect example. Within days, the tone shifted. Late-night comedians seized on it, turning the event into fodder for monologues. They spoke of alien traffic jams over the desert, joked about extraterrestrials missing freeway exits, reducing the gravity of the sightings to absurdity. Editorial cartoons followed, filling newspapers with drawings of flying saucers abducting cows, beaming up tourists, or hovering over Arizona highways with blinking turn signals. The stark, steady, geometric formation of lights that thousands had seen with their own eyes, something that should have been treated as sacred testimony, was reshaped into slapstick. The extraordinary was recast as parody. And then came the governor, Fife Symington, a man who had the weight of the state behind him, a man who knew full well that thousands of citizens were demanding answers. He had been briefed. He had heard the stories. He had seen the fear. And still, at his press conference, he walked onto the stage with cameras rolling and reporters waiting, only to bring out a staffer in a cheap alien costume, complete with bug-eyed mask. The room erupted with laughter. Jokes filled the air. The image was broadcast nationwide. The message was unmistakable. This was not serious. This was a circus. If you believed what you saw, you were a fool. That single stunt did more damage than any official denial ever could, because when the leader of a state treats an event as comedy, the public follows. Those who had been shaken to their core now hesitated. They remembered the governor's smirk, the reporters' laughter, and they thought twice about speaking. The risk was no longer just disbelief. It was humiliation. Years later, Symington admitted the truth. He confessed that he too had seen the craft that night, and not just lights. He described it as massive, silent, and otherworldly. He called it the most extraordinary thing he had ever witnessed. His mockery, he claimed, had been a way to calm public fear, to keep panic from spreading. But by then, the damage had already been done. The ridicule had worked. For years, countless witnesses stayed silent rather than risk being compared to a man in a plastic mask. And in that moment of realization, I learned something chilling. The most effective censorship is not enforced with threats. It is not maintained by force. It is sustained with laughter. Because once the truth becomes a joke, no serious conversation can survive around it. Ridicule is clean. It leaves no evidence. No bruises. No blood. Just silence. The silence of those who decide it's better to say nothing than to risk being mocked in front of neighbors, colleagues, or family. It corrodes credibility in a way bullets never could. Once a story is branded as absurd, it carries that scar forever, no matter how many witnesses insist otherwise. The Phoenix Lights should have been the most important mass sighting in modern history. Instead, it became late-night comedy material. Witnesses who could have spoken out chose, instead, to keep their memories to themselves. Careers that might have contributed testimony chose, instead, to protect reputations. And the truth itself was drowned, not under chains, not under threats, but under laughter. And perhaps that is the most effective cover of all. Because laughter does not just silence a single voice. It spreads. It infects. It rewrites history until the extraordinary becomes ridiculous, until the impossible becomes a punchline, until those who live through it begin to wonder if speaking is worth the cost. And I often wonder, even now, how many truths have already been buried this way? How many Roswells? How many Rendleshams? How many Phoenix Lights have been reduced to cartoons, to punchlines, to monologues delivered to a laughing crowd? How many witnesses carried their truth to the grave, smothered not by secrecy, but by the fear of being laughed out of the room? That, I realized, was the brilliance of ridicule as a weapon. Denial alone can fail. Secrecy alone can crack. But ridicule makes the truth ridiculous. And once that happens, it no longer matters how many witnesses there are, how much footage exists, or how real the event was. If the world is laughing, no one is listening. But ridicule, like denial, has its limits. And the Phoenix Lights were too vast, too undeniable, to be erased by laughter alone. A joke can silence a handful of witnesses. A cartoon can trivialize a story told by one or two. But what happens when the witnesses are not one or two, not dozens, but thousands? What happens when entire neighborhoods, families, children, grandparents, stand in their driveways and look upward together, watching the same impossible shape crawl across the desert sky? That night, whole communities were united by awe and silence. Police officers on patrol pulled their cruisers to the side of the road, radios forgotten, eyes fixed on the heavens. Teachers and doctors, people trained to analyze and verify, stood shoulder to shoulder with their neighbors, their voices trembling as they later described the stars vanishing behind a structure that moved without sound. Airline pilots, men and women whose livelihoods depended on precision and recognition of every aircraft silhouette, spoke of a craft larger than any runway could ever hold. These were not fringe believers seeking headlines. They were not eccentric spinning fantasies in isolation. They were citizens grounded, ordinary, pragmatic, and yet forever changed. They were people who had no reason to lie, no motive to invent, but every reason to remember. And because they remembered, they could not simply be dismissed. So, some of them began to fight back. Almost overnight, grassroots groups sprang up like brush fires across Arizona. Ordinary citizens, people who had never attended a council meeting or filed complaint in their lives, suddenly found themselves drafting letters, organizing gatherings, sharing stories in school gyms and church basements. They refused to allow their voices to vanish into the desert night. They filed Freedom of Information Act requests, demanding transparency, Radar logs, flight schedules, communication transcripts, maintenance records from nearby bases. They wanted answers, and they were willing to dig for them. Most of the requests came back stamped with the same phrase: no records found. Others returned in thick envelopes that, once opened, revealed pages so blackened with redactions that they were unreadable. Whole paragraphs swallowed in ink, entire sections obliterated. What remained were fragments, dates with no context, times with no explanation, words cut off mid-sentence. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like bureaucracy. To those who asked the questions, it was confirmation. There was something to hide. But here was the truth. The act of asking mattered. Each request, even when denied, was an act of defiance against silence. It was proof that the memory had not been buried, that thousands of eyes, once open, could not be closed again so easily. Ufologists, once dismissed as hobbyists or dreamers chasing shadows, suddenly became archivists of testimony. They were no longer merely speculating. They were documenting. They treated witness statements like forensic evidence, cross-referencing times, locations, and descriptions with near-military precision. Some built maps tracing the craft's journey, as if reconstructing a crime scene. The path was chilling in its clarity. The object entered Arizona from the Nevada border, passed over Prescott, where entire neighborhoods described its colossal wingspan, slid across Phoenix, where camcorders captured its silent procession, and then glided down toward Tucson before disappearing into the desert night. When these timelines were placed side by side, when the maps overlapped and the testimonies converged, one conclusion was impossible to deny. The event had been real. The path was undeniable. The witnesses were credible. The footage was damning, and the ridicule strategy began to falter. It is one thing to laugh at a farmer's story of lights in the cornfield. It is another to laugh at airline pilots, police officers, teachers, and children all describing the same event with eerie consistency. Laughter, once a sharp blade, now dulled against the weight of numbers. But still, inside the military, silence only tightened its grip. Orders came sharper, colder. Reports were sealed faster than they could be written. Conversations that once flowed freely in the barracks shrank into whispers, exchanged only in the quiet corners of hangars. Eyes darted nervously before words were spoken, as though every wall might be listening. The burden became unbearable for some. One airman, young, eager, with a career just beginning, transferred within months. Officially, it was routine. Unofficially, it was retreat. He could no longer shoulder the crushing weight of silence. He could no longer live inside a truth he was forbidden to acknowledge. Another confided in me one night, his voice low, his hands trembling, as though each word cost him something vital. He admitted that he had told his family what he had seen. He had described the massive V, the silence, the way the stars themselves seemed to vanish as the craft passed. He had spoken with sincerity, desperate for belief, desperate to shed the memory that was consuming him. But instead of comfort, he met only ridicule. His family laughed nervously, told him he must have been mistaken, that maybe it was planes, maybe it was flares, maybe his mind had played tricks. He smiled as he told me this, but it was the brittle smile of a man disguising a wound that cut too deep to show. And in his eyes, I saw the damage, the kind of hurt that silence carves into the soul. Because silence doesn't just silence. It corrodes. It gnaws at the edges of truth until even the witness begins to doubt. It isolates, turning memory into burden, conviction into torment. That was the cruelest revelation of all. The craft itself was not the greatest weapon. The silence afterward was. The Phoenix lights were not the first, and they would not be the last. For a long time, I wanted to believe that what happened over Arizona was extraordinary in the truest sense of the word. Something unique, an event that would forever stand apart. But the more I studied, the more I listened, the more I followed the faint trails buried under decades of silence, the more a chilling realization began to take hold. Phoenix was not an anomaly. Phoenix was a chapter. The same script had been rehearsed and performed before, and it would be performed again. The choreography was ancient, practiced, precise. First, the impossible appeared. Then came the flood of witnesses. Then came the weight of denial, ridicule, and silence. Over and over. Different names, different dates, different skies. But the story was always the same. 1947, Roswell, New Mexico. The world's first great rupture into the unknown. Newspapers across the nation printed the words, RAF captures flying disc in Roswell region. The U.S. Army itself had admitted it, if only for a moment. Imagine the impact of that headline in 1947, in a time when the idea of UFOs had not yet entered our vocabulary, when flying saucer was still a strange phrase whispered at diner counters. For one day, the truth seemed to stand in the open, and then, within hours, the story changed. The press release was retracted. The phrase flying disc was buried beneath a new explanation, a weather balloon. Witnesses who had held debris in their hands were silenced. Farmers, ranchers, civilians, all told they were mistaken, all told to keep quiet. The wreckage was carted away to military installations, never to be seen again. And in that moment, the blueprint was written, the steps rehearsed. Roswell became not just an event, but a manual for how the truth will be managed for decades to come. 1965. Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. A quiet winter evening shattered by fire streaking across the sky. Locals swore they saw something crash into the woods. At first, the explanation seemed simple, a meteor. But when they reached the site, what they found was not a rock from the heavens. Witnesses described a metallic, bell-shaped object, partly buried in the soil, glowing with residual heat. Strange markings carved along its surface, like hieroglyphs from a language no one could recognize. And then, as if on cue, the military arrived. Not in days, not in hours. Within minutes, trucks rolled into the small town. Soldiers sealed off the woods. Armed men patrolled the roads. By nightfall, the object was loaded onto a flatbed truck, covered with tarp, and driven away under heavy guard. And when the public asked, the official answer, a meteor. But meteors are not carted away on trucks. Meteors are not hidden under canvas and guarded by rifles. The explanation strained belief, but it carried the authority of a state. And that was enough to silence most of the world. 1980, Rendlesham Forest, England. Christmas week. U.S. Air Force personnel stationed in Suffolk reported strange lights descending into the forest. At first, they thought it was a crash, perhaps a downed aircraft. But when they reached the clearing, they found something else. A craft, triangular in shape, metallic, hovering silently above the ground. Some men swore they touched it. They described the heat radiating from its hull, the texture of its surface, the etched symbols carved with precision not of this earth. One man later confessed that those symbols seemed to burn into his mind, as though memory itself had been branded, and yet the official explanation was dismissive, even insulting. A lighthouse, just a lighthouse, blinking through the trees, mistaken by trained Air Force personnel as a craft they stood inches away from. A lighthouse, they told us, mistaken for something men touched with their own hands. The denial was absurd, but the choreography was the same. Witnesses silenced, evidence denied, official story written. 2004, the Tic Tac incident. Off the coast of California, Navy pilots encountered something that defied every law of physics they had ever been taught. White, capsule-shaped craft, smooth, featureless, gliding with impossible speed. They accelerated from a standstill to supersonic in the blink of an eye. They dropped from altitudes of 60,000 feet to sea level in seconds, with no sonic boom, no heat signature, no wings, no propulsion. Radar confirmed what their eyes saw. Infrared recorded what their instruments captured. These were not illusions. These were not glitches. They were craft undeniable, uncatchable. Years later, when the video surfaced, the Pentagon itself confirmed they were authentic. For a moment, it seemed as though the wall of silence had cracked. For a moment, it seemed as though the truth was about to pour through. But then the same pattern unfolded. Denials, ridicule, talking heads dismissing the footage as optical illusions, psychologists explaining away the pilot's testimony as fatigue, stress, imagination. And once again, the witnesses, decorated, experienced men with thousands of flight hours, were reduced to curiosities. Different decades, different continents, different governments, always the same choreography. Step 1, witnesses silenced, careers destroyed, reputations ridiculed. Step 2, evidence denied, radar logs lost, photographs confiscated, reports buried. Step 3, official story crafted, always fragile, always absurd, but always backed by the authority of the state. Weather balloons, meteors, lighthouses, swamp gas, flares. And yet, despite the absurdity, the strategy worked. Because authority, once spoken with confidence, has the power to rewrite memory. The Phoenix Lights were not unique. They were not an isolated anomaly. They were part of a tapestry stretching across generations, a tapestry woven with secrecy, ridicule, and silence, a tapestry that begins in Roswell, bleeds through Kecksburg, scars Rendlesham, echoes off the coast of California, and burns across the sky in Phoenix. Different threads, different times, but all bound together into the same design. And once you see the pattern, you can never unsee it. Once you recognize the choreography, you begin to notice it everywhere, past, present, and perhaps even waiting in the future. Because if Phoenix was only a chapter, then the book is still being written. And none of us know how many pages remain. That is what chills me more deeply than the craft itself. Not the silence of the desert sky, not even the memory of that massive black V blotting out the constellations, swallowing the heavens in a geometry too deliberate to be chance. No, what chills me most is the realization that patterns do not emerge from chaos. Patterns are born from control, and control, by its very nature, means intent. This is a part most people refuse to look at. They want to believe that the cover-ups, the denials, the jokes and staged explanations are just the clumsy reflexes of a bureaucracy that doesn't know what to do. They want to believe the silence is confusion, that the ridicule is incompetence. Because if it's confusion, if it's incompetence, then perhaps the system isn't malicious. It's just flawed. But the deeper you look, the harder that lies to maintain. The denials are too consistent. The ridicule is too rehearsed. The timing is too precise. Chaos does not repeat with such perfection across decades, across continents, across governments. Only control does. And if there is control, then there is intent. And if there is intent, then we must ask the question that hangs over every witness who has ever stared at the impossible. What exactly is being controlled and why? The truth is not hidden because it is unknown. That is the greatest lie ever sold to the public. That our leaders are simply as baffled as we are. No, the truth is hidden because it is known. Known in detail. Known in transcripts stored in vaults. Known in photographs sealed away in boxes marked classified. Known in archives buried so deep in secure facilities that they may never see daylight. Known by officials who sign their names to denials in public while whispering their fears in private. Known by men and women whose lives have been consumed by guarding something they can never admit. That is the greatest secret of all. Not that we are alone. Not that we are visited. But that knowledge itself is the threat. Because if the truth were ever admitted, not speculated, not hinted, not leaked in fragments, but fully admitted, it would shatter the illusions that hold society together. It would strip away the comforting lie that we control the skies, that our governments know all, that our militaries can protect against anything. It would peel back the veneer of order and reveal just how powerless we truly are in the face of what waits above us. And once that illusion is gone, what replaces it? Would it be fear? Panic in the streets? Faith collapsing? Economies crashing as trust evaporates overnight? Would it be chaos as every structure of authority crumbles under the weight of a truth too vast to manage? Or would it be something subtler, something quieter, an erosion of trust so complete that nothing could ever be rebuilt? And yet, there is a third possibility, one I struggle to even whisper to myself in the dark. Maybe what replaces illusion is freedom. Because if the lie is gone, so too is the control. If the truth is known, then we are no longer children being sheltered from what terrifies those in power. We become something else, something responsible for carrying the weight of that knowledge ourselves. And perhaps that is what those in power fear most. I don't have the answer. I only know what I lived. I only know that I once stood beneath a sky devoured by a craft too vast to comprehend, and in that moment the world I thought I knew cracked in half. I only know that silence followed me ever since, wrapping itself around me like a second skin until it became impossible to tell whether I was guarding the truth or whether the truth was guarding me. And I know this. Silence itself has become the greatest weapon of all, not against enemies, but against truth. Silence is patient. Silence corrodes from within. Silence does not need to threaten, because it convinces you to betray yourself. It convinces you to doubt what your own eyes saw. It convinces you to trade memory for comfort, conviction for survival. That is why, decades later, the silence still lingers louder than the night sky itself. Because silence is not the absence of sound. Silence is the presence of control. And so I tell you now, the greatest secret is not that we're being visited. The greatest secret is not the craft in the sky, or the lights that drift across the desert. The greatest secret is that those who know enough to hide it. And they hide it not because we cannot understand it, but because if we did, their control would vanish.